that ultimately, the Russia has much bigger army. Russia has, much bigger appetite to continue. So if you do not want to settle, then you keep fighting.
In a situation like now, I think that President Putin doesn't feel that Russia should go to significant compromises.
But the truth is that if Mr. Trump wants to go through it, he will ensure that weapons don't go anymore to Zelensky.
The idea is that the areas which have been already overtaken by Russia, I don't think many of them, even in Europe, are really expecting it will come back to.
But fundamentally, this is not a war about territory. This is not a war about land. This is a war about the rules of international relations and about extinguishing Ukrainian statehood.
Russia does not accept an idea of a ceasefire because it thinks that it will not help to craft a deal.
Yeah, so I think it is pretty grim for Mr. Zelensky. The life outside power or things, it's a good opportunity for him to somehow cut a deal and get out with some grace. Otherwise, life will become far more difficult.
So Putin's main priority is to reverse the defeat of Russia in the Cold War, to re-establish Russia's position as a superpower on the global stage.
The Donald Vlad plan. What does this Donald Vlad peace plan actually entail? Will Ukraine capitulate? Will Europe stonewall Trump? Will President Putin do what he set out to do? Change the balance of power in Europe and get off the hook for attacking Ukraine? Could this be the starting point to stop this nearly 4-year-old war? Hello everyone, I'm Neena Gopal. Welcome to Global Express, our in-depth analysis of the news story that's making the headlines this week. Do click on the New Indian Express website and watch Global Express. Today, it's US President Donald Trump's renewed push to bring the nearly 4-year-old long conflict between Russia and Ukraine to an end that's dominating the headlines. Made all the more interesting with this leak by Bloomberg of Trump's chief advisor Steve Witkoff telling Putin's foreign policy advisor Yuri Ushakov on what to say to Trump to get him on his side, and successfully blocking the sale of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Trump's 28-point plan has been whittled down to 19 after Sunday's talks in Geneva, but it's not clear what the 19 points are. Either way, Kiev continues to see it as a Russia-friendly deal. It hinges, just as it has done before, on whether Kiev will cede territory to Russia, and it continues to pit Washington against Europe. But is there a sliver of hope that Trump could pull off a deal? Russian energy worth $100 trillion for all of Eurasia in return for a greater Russian footprint in Europe. A flurry of diplomatic engagements in Geneva and Abu Dhabi and now Moscow has raised the possibility that the worst conflict in Europe since World War II could be approaching the endgame. Trump's post on Truth Social, saying something good just may be happening, was followed by a comment on Air Force One that his 28-point plan was a concept. But is it? With Russia's wish list seen as unrealistic, as unacceptable, to Ukraine, to Europe, can it go forward? Europe, alarmed at great powers negotiating without the Europeans and Ukrainians, wants its voice heard for a real, sustainable peace in Ukraine, as German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said. Europe is not a plaything, but a sovereign actor. EU Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen has laid it out. Security guarantees for Ukraine, no limitations on Ukraine's armed forces, or blocking its path to NATO membership. This is about deterrence, she said. Ukraine's security is Europe's security, she said. But the Russian President Vladimir Putin, set to arrive in Delhi for a hopefully triumphal India-Russia summit on December 5th, is standing his ground. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, heading next week to Washington for a key confab with Trump. What are the options before him? Talking to us today on the ongoing talks that the US has been holding with Russian officials and with Ukraine and European leaders are experts who span the spectrum. On our panel is Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, a veteran journalist and foreign policy specialist focused on India, its neighborhood, and West Asia. He's the founder editor of Hard News, a political monthly. Welcome, Mr. Kapoor. Also with us is Professor Gulshan Sachedva, the Jean Monnet Chair, who heads the Center for European Studies, School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome, Professor Sachedva. Giving us the Russian perspective is Mr. Alexei Zakharov, Fellow with the Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation. Welcome, Mr. Zakharov. And last but not least, Dr. Peter Dickinson, a senior journalist, editor and commentator based in Ukraine since the late 90s. He's the editor of the Washington-based think tank, the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert. Welcome, Dr. Dickinson. Let's start with President Trump's peace plan. Would it be right to say it hasn't evolved beyond the discussions that were held when Trump and Putin met in Alaska, with the main focus then as now centering on Ukraine, giving up territory, Ukraine not joining NATO? Sunday's talks in Geneva, where Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with the Ukrainian team, led by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky's Chief of Staff Andrei Yermak and a team of national security advisors from Europe to discuss the peace plan, is said to have refined the peace framework. What do you think is meant by the term refined?
Honestly, I think it means removing all of the things that Russia wants and putting all the things that Europe and Ukraine want into the plan, essentially. I mean, certainly it means removing the most extreme Russian positions and trying to create something that Ukraine can accept. Of course, the consequence of that is going to be the Russians will very likely say that they no longer accept the basis.
So from what one hears, these are Europe's red lines, right? I mean, UK, France and Germany have insisted that territorial talks will only start after a ceasefire. There'll be no cap on Ukraine's army. NATO membership, is still open to Ukraine. Security guarantees are going to be in place for Ukraine. But Ukraine will be forced to give up Donbass, which Russia still does not control fully. It'll have to freeze its front line. And the Russian presence on Ukrainian soil that could keep the door open for a future Russian attack without the NATO membership cover is a possibility. Do you agree with that, Mr. Zakharov?
Well, there are many things that discussed there, but to my mind, the peace agreement, I mean, the initial peace proposal that we saw a week ago, I mean, the initial the so-called 28-point plan, I don't think that it was as much Russia-friendly or as much extremely pushing Russian demands as we've heard from Moscow's statements. And I think that actually, if we look carefully at the Russian position, like outlined many times by President Putin, I think that there was more emphasis, not as much on territories, but on the Ukrainian neutral status first, and secondly, on the so-called demilitarization part. First, on the Ukrainian neutral status that Ukraine should not join NATO, and secondly, that its military capabilities should be cut down in the form of capping the number of troops and also its defense capabilities in terms of like long-range missile, for instance, systems. And what we saw in the 28-point plan included an army of 600,000 people, 600,000 troops. Then I think the new version included a higher number. So I don't think that it responds to the Moscow's vision. That's why on this point it doesn't look like Russia should be satisfied with this. That's why I think that this refinement of the text can go further, and it will be difficult to strike a deal or reach a compromise on this particular point. Like from the Ukrainian perspective, it's important to achieve sufficient security guarantees including a capability to defend themselves with help from the West, including developing its defense in a way that they want to. From the Russian perspective, Ukraine should sign up to having a very small army and refuse from essentially defending itself. So it's something that is difficult to narrow, and I think it will be a major issue during the discussions.
Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, if you could come in, do you think Ukraine has got its back to the wall? Because, I mean, these are very contentious issues. Ukraine wants guarantees against future Russian attacks. It wants the rebuilding of a post-war Ukraine. It's clearly unwilling to give up Donetsk and the territories that this it does look as if the whole thing favors the Kremlin right now, because even parts of Donbass is something that Ukraine still holds. I mean, it isn't under Russia's control at the moment. So why hand over areas that are not even occupied is the question, right? I mean, that's what jumps out from this whole conversation.
Yeah, thank you for giving me a chance to be on your panel. I think it's a really complicated issue how this entire process being played out, primarily because the Europeans are not on board. Europeans are very adamant that they would like to bail out to back Ukraine in a manner that is find the Russia and even US for that matter finds deeply offensive. And in those circumstances, it becomes very difficult for it to go through because Ukraine is part of Europe. And they think that if Ukraine is gone, every other country would be deeply vulnerable. So it's not just addressing the problems of Ukraine, US and Russia have to address the problems of the other European countries, especially the more vociferous and more voluble ones like Germany and France for that matter. And at the same time, you have the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who's also playing his own games. So this is an opportunity which has been presented to the European countries to do certain things which are, make for a very interesting reading. This is like a theater being played out. But having said that, both sides want the war to end. It's a matter of shame that President Trump, despite the fact that he thought it'll get over in 15 days, hasn't really been able to sue up the whole thing. Or for that matter, Mr. President Putin, who thinks that if the war doesn't continue, he will get weaker by the day because his fortunes have really picked up in the last 2 years since the war has begun, despite the fact that the Americans were expecting him to bleed further. I mean, the manner in which the sanctions were imposed, the severest sanctions you can ever think of. But despite that, the Russians have done very well. In fact, if you look at it, they managed to shift a major portion of oil production to India. Almost there's been an increase of 1,000%. Just that kind of shift is amazing in how it happened. And I think it had the concurrence of the United States of America, despite whatever President Trump might say now. But the earlier regime, earlier dispensation was backing it. So you have a very complicated picture where Russia has benefited, China has become a major power, and India also was doing well to the time pressure began to mount on India from Russia, from the US, that it should give up oil from Russia. So in a way,
That's
it's
right.
not a easy picture to define. And I'm sure President Putin and President Trump are adamant that something should happen at the earliest, because President
That's right.
was very keen that there should be a meeting between the two presidents in Hungary, which didn't happen. And
That's right, in Budapest.
yeah, so in Budapest, and according to reports, President Putin was very angry with his foreign minister. That's why couldn't he seal it. So there are too many sensitivities that are built into it. My friends from Russia and Ukraine would probably enlighten us more on that.
Yeah, I'm going to actually go to Dr. Gulshan Sachedva to ask him why he thinks the Ukraine would even agree to something like this, because it doesn't, every attempt at peace has followed the same path, right? I mean, they signaled concessions to Russia before negotiations even began. I remember reading French President Emmanuel Macron's comments several months ago in February, where he says peace that is a capitulation would be bad news for everyone. My question is, would Ukraine and Europe now agree to another capitulation, so to speak?
Well, thank you, Neena, for inviting me. And, just following what Mr. Sanjay Kapoor was mentioning, obviously it's a complicated situation. If it was simple, they would have found some solution. And this is not just only about Ukraine, and it's also not just only about certain territories. Obviously, Europeans are worried about that if something happens, some kind of peace deal in a manner which happened, that ultimately it gives much bigger scope for Russia to play within the European security architecture, and this could continue to be a threat to Europe. That's what all the Baltics, other smaller countries, and the neighboring countries are worried all the time. Of course, Russia always says that they do not have those kind of intentions, but because the geographies are different, they situated there, they have their own history, so they have worries. Similarly, for United States, it's also they keep changing, of course. But I think the way it looks to me, the way things have happened, I mean, ultimately, many things would be decided on the basis of understanding or assessment by all parties that what is really happening militarily at the ground.
Yes, that's very important.
Is That's what, in fact, many time, in fact, the American administration has been hinting. President Trump has been saying that ultimately, the Russia has much bigger army. Russia has, much bigger appetite to continue. So if you do not want to settle, then you keep fighting. And we are not going to support very long for the Europeans keep supplying, and then you can keep fighting. Now, if the assessment of the Europeans, as they continue to say that yes, Ukraine, with the support of Europe, and also to some extent, if the continue some kind of support from the US, Ukraine would be able to hold for some more time, and then in the meanwhile, they'll see what happens. Now, the problem has been, I think, that. And Russia can continue to fight because this is what they have been doing it, and they can do it for a couple of more months. That, I think, is not really the way things are played out. Of course, they are under stress. Their economy is having all kind of sanctions, all kind of problems, but they have now worked out a system in which they can continue for, even for a couple of years. I mean, they can do that. Of course, they'll be bleeding, but that's how things are. So ultimately, this is in the everybody's benefit that some kind of solution is found. Now, and I think even within Europe, if you look at statements from the UK, if you look at statements from France, and of course, from country like Hungary, etc. Now they have understood that Ukraine at this point of time is not in a very strong position.
So you mean militarily and
Economically
economically?
and otherwise, I mean, because the US is not willing to support the way it used to be, and the Europeans can't just keep pumping money. So they would like to see, but at the same time, the Europe is much more complicated business here because the within the European Union, if you look at statements from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, or of course also from the foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas. I mean, she has been very hawkish on many of those issues. So they comes out with a very different kind of assessment. But I think by and large, now even Ursula von der Leyen has also mentioned, I think yesterday or day before yesterday, that at least there is something to begin. At least there is something.
Okay.
To see. So it means now, I mean, earlier, when the plan came, of course, the many plans have come. The Europeans have also come out their own plan as what had been reported. I mean, the initially kind of the reaction in Europe was that no, this is non-workable. This is just a sell to Russia. But I think the way many talks have happened between the United States and Russian officials and the European officials, and also between Ukrainians and the United States, because ultimately it's up to the Ukraine to decide.
But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that Ukraine doesn't seem to seems to have been out of the loop, because I mean, there's this gentleman called Rustem Umerov, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, saying that Ukraine had absolutely no involvement in drafting the plan. Mr. Dickinson, would you like to comment on that? Because the White House says it was crafted in, it was drafted in consultation with both sides. Russia says it's also the draft only later. Now you have Ukraine also saying this. I mean, who drafted this deal?
Well, that's a very good question. If you read the original 28-point plan, and if you have any knowledge at all of the Russian language and of the lexicon used by the Kremlin in official documents, you would immediately recognize that this is a Russian language document that has been translated rather clumsily, I would say, from the Russian into the English. I mean, it was clear as day to anyone who read that document. As I say, who is familiar with Russian, they would immediately recognize this is a Russian language document. So I think the Russian imprint is very clear. Did Ukraine also have any input into it? Well, that's not so clear. Of course, the Americans are maintaining a dialogue with Ukraine, so they may have raised Ukraine's positions during their discussions with the Russians. But I think it's pretty clear that that original document came from the Russian side originally. It was translated and presented, and we've heard that from members of the American administration. Marco Rubio reportedly told a number of senators exactly that it was a Russian document a few days ago. He then backtracked on that once he received a lot of negative. Presumably, he got a call from the White House telling him that was a very, very inappropriate comment. But he certainly said that, and then the senators, a number of senators, all confirmed that. So I think the original document was certainly drawn up by the Russians. Were the Ukrainians involved? There's not a lot of evidence of that. But of course, now the next stage, we're seeing that. We're seeing the Ukrainians have a much more prominent role in reshaping it. The next stage is going to be putting that to the Russians and getting their response. My prediction will be the Russians will now say, well, we don't agree to any of this. This is now not a Russian wish list, it's a Ukrainian wish list. And we go back to square one almost.
So the only way this war can be brought to an end, I mean, is it the only way that we can bring the war to an end by getting Russia on board, with Ukraine giving up something? I mean, because it looks almost as if the way that the US has dealt with it so far, that it is President Putin talking to, I mean, I may be wrong, I may be getting it completely wrong, but I almost feel as if he's dictating terms. Do you think that's true, Mr. Zakharov?
Vladimir Putin dictating terms, you mean?
Yeah, is President Putin dictating terms?
At least he is not backing off from his maximalist demands. I think that's true. I think that I would second what Professor Sachedva mentioned, that in a situation like now, I think that President Putin doesn't feel that Russia should go to significant compromises because according to the situation on the battlefield, and I think in a way it's acknowledged by different military experts, Russian troops are advancing. Of course, it's happening slowly. Of course, it doesn't mean that there is any collapse of Ukrainian defense, but at the same time, they are advancing in different sectors, in different regions, even in those regions that are not there, that are not part of the peace negotiations. That's why I think that he might feel that it creates some pressure on the Ukrainian positions at the talks and at the negotiating table. That's why, I mean, in a situation like this, when you don't have, you don't have a collapse of the Ukrainian defense on the one side, you don't have a significant advantage on the Russian side, but you have some kind of a middle situation. It's still really difficult to craft a truly, viable and truly long-term peace deal.
So you're saying there could be no ceasefire either as a starting point.
Russia does not accept an idea of a ceasefire because it thinks that it will not help to craft a deal. That's why, I mean, in this kind of a situation, both parties would feel that they still can carry on the fight and that probably, I mean, diplomacy can be really protracted.
Okay, so basically, Sanjay Kapoor, if I could just bring you in, why is the US looking as if it leans towards Russia's position more than it does to Ukraine's? Because as Mr. Dickinson actually said, this whole document looked as if it was crafted by Russia and then put forward by the Americans. Why would they do that? I mean, is this because they feel that only terms acceptable to Russia will bring this to an end? But that is not going to work with Europe and Ukraine.
Let's face it, the truth is that the President Donald Trump has always been accused of being close to Russians. And when you met him, or even at the time when he won the first term, there were allegations that the entire election was managed by President Putin. So that may not have held much water, the allegations, but for believers, it may have stuck. Subsequently, if you look at it, they both met in Alaska, looked very, very friendly as if they knew each other. And their impression was that everything will happen fine. But you look at it, I mean, if you see the manner in which the process is playing out, there is a great amount of pressure being put by the European powers, so much so that the people are talking about how a major conversation between the Russian advisor to on Ukraine and Wiskov, who's the negotiator on behalf of the US, could be leaked to Bloomberg.
Yes, that was a very interesting leak.
Yeah, so there are sentences, there are expressions which suggest the Russians are being held by the Americans. So Russian government has been calling it a hybrid as a part of the hybrid war. They don't know who leaked it, why was it leaked, and all that. Is obviously the leak has happened because the Europeans are involved. They don't want this deal to go through in the manner it is going in. But the truth is that if Mr. Trump wants to go through it, he will ensure that weapons don't go to the anymore to Zelensky, and even the allegation of corruption which has been leveled against him by the it came up in the Hungarian parliament about 20% of all the aid which goes to Ukraine is being skimmed off by him. So all those things will gather further momentum.
That's true. Has it weakened his hand, you think? Has it weakened Vladimir Zelensky's hand in this game after these corruption allegations?
Yeah, so I think it is pretty grim for Mr. Zelensky. The life outside power or things. It's a good opportunity for him to somehow cut a deal and get out with some grace. Otherwise, life will become far more difficult. So that is why I don't think he's seemingly averse. The Europeans are deeply averse. They don't like all the things that they have been spending money, investment, and politics over the last few months and years come to a naught. So that is why how it is being played out.
Now, Dr. Sachedva, if I could come to you, Russia has other neighbors like Moldova and Georgia. Would they be comfortable with Russia's forcible sort of partitioning of Ukraine? Because this is a Russia which has a huge defense budget this time's budget is US dollars 145 billion. And, the front line of NATO, is destabilized, so to speak. And it's been criticized as the start of a Cold War 2.0. So, it almost seems as if Europe has been incapable or unwilling to take on Russia front on. Would that be a correct assessment to make? Because the US policy on Ukraine has also been pretty harsh in the sense it's denied it military intelligence. It hasn't really supplied it with the weapons that it should, because it's now left to the UK and to France and Germany to do that.
Well, in fact, most countries in Europe, including even friendly countries within the post-Soviet space, obviously they are not comfortable the way things have happened, the way Russia has expanded in Ukraine and in other places as well. But the fact of the matter is, then what do you do? One is that this is what, in fact, when the whole thing started, the whole Western objective was obviously they didn't like, because you can't just, the principal position of Europe has been that you cannot violate territorial integrity of any sovereign state. And the sovereign, every sovereign state, including Ukraine, and they have they're equal. I mean, they have the right to choose who their friends could be if they want to choose NATO or European Union or anything else. It's up to them. So that's a principal position. But the way I think the war has gone on for the last so long now.
3 years, almost 4 years, if when it comes February.
Now, suddenly, what has changed fundamentally is that the Americans have changed their position under President Trump. Now, if they would have continued like we had during Biden, continue to fund, continue to support, continue to provide weapons, and of course, Europeans also would have been doing whatever they have been doing, maybe things would have been slightly different. And now, if assessment for whatever reason, of American administration is that Ukraine cannot continue to fight unless we keep pumping money, and they don't want to do that. And they somehow feel that yes, if certain territorial compromises have to be made, so be it. But then we can find. I mean, now of course this is the starting position of all 28 points or whatever points from different places are coming. The idea is that the areas which have been already overtaken by Russia, I don't think many of them, even in Europe, are really expecting it will come back to.
Oh, I see. That's interesting.
You have to physically take back those areas. I mean, otherwise Russia is nowhere to give up. They've already declared this part of Russia. Now, how do you reconcile with this? One is you keep fighting, hoping that ultimately you will be able to recover. And it's not something that, I would say it's not about the Donbass and other region now. I mean, even when Crimea was taken in 2014, that was exactly the same thing which happened in 2014. But Europeans, of course, they started some sanctions, etc. But they continue kind of think that, okay, it has been taken over and it was kind of accepted by European. Only thing they became very for them, it became very difficult when Russia actually went to other areas as well. So now, to me, particularly for the US, I think territory is not a major issue. They have already kind of understood that territory has to be compromised. Now, only thing is that after that, what happens? Now, and I think many Europeans also would have thought that, the territories which already been taken over by Russia, it will be very difficult to take back. Unless you fight and take it back, which for 3 years have shown that that's not very easy. Now, some compromise, of course, at the end would be made, some borders here or there. But then the question for them is long term. If today you make a compromise on this, then I think their worry has been that it can come back again to Ukraine in some other place, some other time, and to other countries as well, the Baltics and other places as well. So that is what their worry is, and this is what Russia has been saying, that they have no intention of doing that. Now, whether you accept or you don't accept it, now the whole, I think, the understanding, if any kind of peace deal will have to happen. Now, the Europeans are very keen to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, that even
Yes.
after compromise is made on territorial integrity of Ukraine, but then you have to have real security, kind of if not NATO membership, but similar kind of thing. Now, for Russia, this is again a very serious no-no, because they do not want not just only the membership of Ukraine to NATO, but even foreign troops on the NATO territories providing that security. Now, how do you really then do some kind of work? This is what they have to negotiate now. This is what the work has been. So there's some compromise of territory, and then some kind of security guarantee, I think, has to be provided, and some kind of a future, I would say, commitment from Russia. Now, whatever that commitment is, in whatever manner it has to be, but that even after that happens, the problem for Europe would be that in that case, the Russia has come back to Europe in a very different
That's
manner.
right.
So they would be able to kind of decide what European security would be if NATO will not expand to other areas, obviously not just only in Ukraine, but they can also have certain other red lines. So the Europeans European peacekeepings cannot be, if that cannot be within Ukraine, then how do you really defend? So all I think those are the issues which are much more serious than to me than certain territorial issues, which of course are very serious. But I think those issues perhaps could be tackled. My feeling is that the other broader issues, which has much long-term implications for the European security, for Russia's role in Europe, and also in this whole Eurasian region. And for about this now, the Americans perhaps seems to have a different kind of assessment.
That's
What they
true.
feel is that once, the Russia does not have that kind of intentions about Europe. This is what they feel, that they have certain, they want to have certain kind of influence within their own areas, neighboring areas. If that is done, after that, it's good to do business with Russia. It's a big opportunity for many other things. This is what perhaps broadly things. So now, after all these different plans, of course, the starting point of plan always is different than what the end point of that, whatever the
Yes, yes.
event would be. So many of these things would be discussed, whether things will happen in the next few days or few weeks, or it may take couple of
Couple of
months.
months. Can I bring you in, Mr. Dickinson? Please tell us what you think is going to happen, because the Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, it's all, there's already de facto recognition of the fact that Russia occupies these territories, and that could extend to Kherson and Zaporizhia. So, what are we looking at? Are we looking at this, as someone said, a German-style reunification of Russia, of its old the territories that it once, had under its, when it was the Soviet Union? And how will Ukraine live with that?
Well, I've never heard it described as a German-style reunification before. That's a remarkable statement.
Well, I'm quoting an analyst called Mark Galliotti.
Yeah, that would sound about right. Yeah, the Russians would certainly make such a comment, but I've never heard it coming from an international source before. Yeah, it's certainly not a reunification. Of course, it's a conquest. But fundamentally, this is not a war about territory. This is not a war about land. This is a war about the rules of international relations, and about extinguishing Ukrainian statehood. Vladimir Putin is a child of the Cold War. He grew up in the Cold War. He served as a KGB officer in East Germany, and he was a witness when the Berlin Wall fell down and the Soviet Empire in Europe collapsed. His whole world collapsed. He went from being in a very prestigious position, in being a part of an elite of a superpower, a KGB officer in the Soviet Union. Within a couple of years, he was a very poverty-stricken man with a family to provide for back in independent Russia. He saw the Russian economy collapse, and this has shaped his whole worldview. So Putin's main priority is to reverse the defeat of Russia in the Cold War, to re-establish Russia's position as a superpower on the global stage. And he's become obsessed by the idea that the way to do this is to end Ukrainian independence and essentially end Ukrainian statehood. So it's not really about Lugansk or Donetsk or Crimea or any of the other regions we're talking about. It's about the whole of Ukraine. He will keep going with this goal until he achieves that goal of ending Ukrainian independence, unless he's stopped. So the question is how to stop him. Can he be stopped by compromises? Well, I would say that that's absurd. I think it's delusional to think that he will simply accept some form of compromise. And just imagine for a moment if he accepted the current terms of the peace deal, which would leave him with 20% of Ukraine in Russian hands, but 80% of Ukraine free. Now, that 80% of Ukraine would be hostile to Russia. It would be integrated into the Western world. Now, anyone in Russia would see that as a massive defeat for Russia, a massive strategic defeat. It would probably mean the end of the Putin regime. It could mean the end of the Russian Federation itself. But certainly it would be a major, major setback for Russia. So Putin has to continue this war. These negotiations now are part of his game. They're part of his stalling tactics. But he cannot accept the continued existence of an independent Ukraine. And he's been quite clear about that. We're seeing in the areas of Ukraine that are under Russian occupation now, they're not simply establishing political control, they are systematically erasing all traces of Ukrainian statehood, Ukrainian national identity, Ukrainian culture and heritage. We all know about the children who've been abducted to Russia, where they are exposed to indoctrination to turn them from Ukrainians into Russians. This is a systematic campaign because Putin believes he must do this in order to safeguard Russia's position in the world and reverse what happened in 1991. So I think this is, we need to recognize this, and the international community needs to understand they can't compromise with Putin, they can only stop him.
That's very interesting. Mrs. Zakharov, do you have a counter? Is this the way the cookie crumbles?
Oh, well, I agree with some points that the military effort is part probably of a whole attempt to exert influence on the Ukrainian political system and essentially to put a pressure on a political regime in Ukraine, which Russia sees as hostile to its interests. So it's a classic continuation of politics by other means. So I wouldn't exclude that the whole idea is to ensure that Ukraine has a new government, which will reconsider its Western-oriented policy, and that will, pursue a more neutral policy towards, in between Russia and the West. At the same time, I think that it's an over-exaggeration to say that if the western part of Ukraine will be joining the Western institutions, that it will become a strategic defeat for Russia, and that it has some consequences for the Putin's regime. I think that even at some point Moscow can accept that the Ukraine, the largest part of the country, is joining the European Union. A red line for Moscow is obviously about Ukraine joining NATO, but I think that in the current situation, when Ukraine has so much uncertainty about territories, it's in a state of war, the territorial question can be protracted for many years. I don't think that NATO can technically accept.
What exactly, Mr. Zakharov, is Russia's objections to Ukraine joining NATO? It's because Poland did, the Baltic states did. Is that what the problem is? They feel that the old Soviet Union, is non-existent, and it wants to recreate it.
Yeah, it's a good question, particularly if we take into account that after 2022, we have Nordic countries like Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and they are standing on the Russian border. Finland is just having a very long border with Russia. In addition, the whole Baltic region is now very much under control of NATO, if we take into account that these countries are no longer neutral. So it's a completely changing situation. Geostrategic situation for Russia in this on its non-northwestern borders. So yeah, what we have to come back. What's there special about Ukraine? And here it becomes very complicated to explain, because some of it has to do with personal convictions by the Russian president, by some historical factors, and also how the situation evolved after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because there were different contradictions between the two countries. So Ukraine obviously occupies special place in Russia's foreign policy and how Russia perceives its status, its role in the post-Soviet Union. That's why, obviously, for Moscow at this current stage, it's unacceptable that that NATO will be present in Ukraine. That's the talking point.
That's actually quite the red line, really. Sanjay Kapoor, if I could also come back to the US so-called appeasement of Russia, it sort of almost looks as if Russia's silent partner, China, is being encouraged to ratchet up its plans on Taiwan. The last couple of days, we've seen Chinese rhetoric on Taiwan is becoming extremely confrontational. Do you agree with that at all? That this sort of allowing China such a long rope?
This is very, very bizarre as to how it is playing out, primarily because one expected diminution and depletion of Russian as a state after when the war began and when all the sanctions were imposed. But as brought out by Jeffrey Sachs and John Mayer Scheimer, there's been a shift in the entire emphasis. If you look at it, Russia is now a big power. They have loads of money. China has also shown a great amount of progress in terms of its strength. It's become a power unto itself. It stands shoulder to shoulder with Putin, with the President Trump's country USA, and President Trump recognizes it. In fact, he's been very candid about calling it G2, in which it says about the China making so much progress. So, having said that, I think President Trump is preparing the world for a new world order in a certain way, where China pretty much gets whatever it wants. Russia manages to get something, whatever it wants, and other countries can go for a walk. They don't really matter for him.
Mm.
And India is unhappily one of them. Time and again, there are a lot of things that are happening which kind of make India feel a bit smaller in comparison to what it was when the Democrats were in power, when President Biden was in power. But now the situation is slowly developing like that. But if you allow me to say that, the what has happened in Russia is very, very dramatic, primarily because you have a president in the US and you have the Russian president largely on the same page. You have two people, both President Trump and Viskov, who's the intermediary, who are the negotiator, actually, not the intermediary, but the
They're all cut from the same cloth, you're saying.
cut from the same cloth. They have been doing pretty much the same thing. And Viskov has had dealing with the Russians in the past. Almost speaks like the same language also. I don't know whether he does that, but he knows a lot of Russian. So it's really working out in a manner which I don't think the Ukrainians were expecting. And Ukrainians are having a tough time trying to understand how the reality is going to change, because the president has outlived his democratic status. He's no longer, he's gone beyond his term. So that has become a handle for Mr. Putin to keep on reminding him. So it's a very difficult situation for Ukraine and how
Vladimir
to manage.
Zelensky. Dr. Sachdev, if I could just come back to you, what is Russia's real game plan? Because, I've read that it wants to be readmitted to the Group of Seven. And so, because it was edged out in 2014 when it took Crimea. So, it wants to be part of a G8. And also it wants to reintegrate into the global economy, is what I've been told. That it wants the sanctions to be lifted. It wants economic cooperation to be restored. I mean, there are $100 billion in frozen assets that it wants to unfreeze. So, is there a secret kind of deal, behind the scenes deal between the US and Russia? Because if the US does actually agree to take part in reconstruction, it is envisaging almost getting rich off it, and getting 50% of the profits.
Well, in fact, the question you started, what is Russia's, real game plan here is, this is very interesting because, of course, game plan would have also changed the way last 4 years things have played out, because they might have started with something else, and now the way things are played out is obviously would have impacted the whole scenario very, very differently.
I see.
I mean, many things what you have mentioned, becoming part of G7, G8, or integrated with the European, to some extent, within the European economic space and other issues, and very good partnership on energy with Europe, and most of the things are already happening. It's not something that we are seeing that it can happen. For many years, they were part of G8. They had a very solid energy partnership with Russia. Most of the European companies, they were doing very good business in Russia, and Russians were also spending a lot of money and all across Europe, because so it's not something that suddenly they are asking. They were also trying to integrate within the global economy, which they did in whatever manner, because they didn't really, I would say, sufficiently industrialized, Russia, because so much natural resources were there, so that was enough perhaps, and defense industry, etc., which were continuing. But when all these things were happening, they thought there is a certain kind of understanding with the West, with the United States, and also particularly with the Europe. But the way, I mean, why you also ask question why Ukraine is so special? Why, in fact, others are also
Yes.
members of NATO, and uh, you know, why Ukraine becomes special, because many of the things which actually were happening they were integrating with each other. Things started falling apart from the Ukraine itself, because when the Europeans started interfering, Americans started interfering the way the European, I would say, Ukrainian political system, because both wanted to integrate Russia within Ukraine, within the Eurasian economic space, Eurasian Economic Union, and many of the linkages the European Union was trying. And even today, Russia does not have any objection to Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union. They have only
I see.
objection to
To
basically
NATO.
now. So they started. I mean, I think the understanding within Russia, as I can see, is that we were doing all what which could have been done. We were working very closely with the Europe. We were also having certain understanding with the United States, and we were also, all the energy linkages were there, for decades. But somehow still they thought that the West is pushing further, and the Ukraine was a critical case there, because through Ukraine they tried to push many things which Russia didn't like. So this is what, perhaps that's why the Ukraine became much more, I would say, critical in I would say, thinking of within Russia. And to some extent, the territory is not really such an issue in that. That's what I'm saying. Territorial, compromises could be made, but now assessment different from different places. Now the European assessment, as I think Mr. Dickinson has also mentioned, that it's not just only about territory of 20%, but they want to conquer the whole Ukraine and statehood or something. That's one assessment, which I would say it's not just diminishing. I would say Russia, Ukrainian statehood, that would be their ultimate goal. What they obviously would like, that very friendly regime in neighboring countries. They would not like to have a regime in these places which is very much under influence of the West, particularly the United States or of Europe. And that's what their, I think, assessment is. That's what their goal is. And it's not just, this is also, it's not just only this. If you look at the plan, and the plan was also 100 days, election within Ukraine. So it means you also have certain political plan after that. It's not just, but territory become important, because only through conquering certain territory you can push your things. Because if that wouldn't have happened, maybe we would be talking about something very differently. So even now, if the assessment is that you can actually take territory back from Russia, then West will not be talking to Russians. So then the terms would be very, very different. So now, if the assessment is that it's very difficult to really take back that territory, so at least do something in which we can have some kind of a peace settlement, which Russia may not be really such a big threat. But the Russian design is that, of course, they want also friendly kind of thing. Maybe that's integrated with the European Union. That's all right. Other thing.
So they basically want a malleable government in Kiev.
Absolutely. This is what their ultimate goal would be. Whether they'll be able to achieve or not, that of course the time will tell. But this is what they will continue to do till the time they're able to achieve this.
Mr. Zakharov, there's this talk about Russia being asked to sign a non-aggression pact. so it will not invade its neighbors, because it's done it repeatedly, right? I mean, it's the invasion of Ukraine is supposed to be a breach of the 1994 Budapest Agreement, where Russia and the US agreed to respect Ukraine's borders. I mean, would you like to explain why Russia broke it? I mean, it's did the same thing with the Minsk Agreement in 2014 and 2015, and basically it looks as if Russia is, trying to change the balance of power in Europe.
Yeah, that's one more point in the plan that actually raises questions. If it was indeed drafted by Russia, then the kind of signing of this plan is an interesting thing, because I think that this war actually set many precedents, including for the Russian neighborhood. That's why I think that signing this kind of a document would be important. But on the other side, of course, we should ask ourselves, how much trust do other countries have in any new documents appearing? And here we can refer to different documents like Budapest Memorandum, Minsk agreements. With Minsk agreements, it's a bit more complicated, because there were, Ukraine also signed up to its conditions, but the Ukrainian government was not so much willing to advance with all the points. So, I think that both parties were kind of not abiding by all the things that they agreed in the Minsk agreements. But in any case, any new peace plan, any new document signed will raise doubts about its viability and about both parties, or all the parties, if there are more than two signatories to it, if all the parties will abide by the points that they negotiated.
Yeah, Sanjay Kapoor, if I can come to you about India, because we're actually navigating very tricky waters. Given our extremely close ties to Moscow, our attempts to strengthen ties with Europe and Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi's visit there was a little odd, and Trump's Washington, where ties haven't been smooth, as you've said, they've tariffed us for buying Russian oil. So we have to balance geopolitics and energy security. So the fresh US sanctions have been imposed on Rosneft and Lukoil. So how does India handle this? Because moving away from Russian crude is not an easy option for us, because as you've all mentioned, our economic policy, we benefited greatly from cheap Russian oil, and do you think that now that Russia is engaging with the US in the way it is, that we could then go back to, our connection with Russia, buying Russian oil rather than buying West Asian crude? Because India's demands are 1.5 billion barrels a day.
Yeah, this is a very tricky situation, because India is being forced to go back to the days when it didn't buy even 1% of what it is buying today. In the last 2.5 years, it has gone up to 1,000 times of what we used to buy in the early days, just 1%. Now, with the situation like this, with the US pressuring, making it a point that India has to stop buying oil from Russia and to somehow economically diminish Russian Republic, India doesn't want to give an impression, because it's Russia has been India's all-weather friend. It has supported in war, it's supported in peace, and we are used to having yearly summits for many years. President Putin is again coming on the 5th or the 6th to India, where I think they will discuss exactly how India hopes to replace the oil which will discontinue under pressure from the US with something else. Although India hasn't really hasn't agreed on buying the fighter jets from Russia as yet, but there are a lot of things that need to be discussed, and India has to do it with Russia, provide some kind of comfort to the Russians that, look here, may not be buying under US, but once your deal gets sorted out, you might go back to doing it. So India would be interested in fast tracking everything that is on slow burn at the moment, ensuring that US and Russia make up fast, and after doing that, they would also want Europe to be on our side, because they recognize in certain ways that the US is no longer the power it used to be. It is the shift is irreversible. The shift between that has taken place post the Ukraine war in 2023, and has been pointed out, as I said, John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, that it has happened with such a great speed. It's irreversible, and India doesn't want to lose out on the new order, which it is part of it. I mean, we are one of the architects of this new order. So, but we also get pulled in a different direction by the Americans. So, with America not playing ball with us, despite the fact that we're willing to do everything, we are in a difficult situation. We have to hang on to the new order, but Chinese have a different way of treating us. The Russians don't trust us. So let's see how it all plays out.
Russians don't trust us.
Absolutely.
That's very interesting because I thought that India, with the offer of buying 5 squadrons of the S-400 Triumph air defense system and all of these surface-to-air missiles that worked during Operation Sindoor, that India's Russia was going to be, the strongest relationship that we would have.
But if we come under pressure of the Americans that we stop buying oil altogether, so is
Yeah.
it with the with the connivance or with the agreement of the Russians, or what is happening? I mean, time and again, I think President Putin has been very upset with India for looking west far more than we should, and ignoring Russia. And that has been
Yeah.
doing it. India has been doing that even from the days of Manmohan Singh.
That's very interesting. Mr. Dickinson, Dr. Sachdev, and Alexei Zakharov, if you can make your concluding remarks, that'll be good. What do you expect to see happen in the next few weeks, Mr. Dickinson?
Well, I think we'll have a lot of very loud declarations, but I would be surprised if there was any concrete progress. I simply don't see any middle ground between the two sides here in this war where they can make meaningful compromises. I think Ukraine's main goal is to avoid losing what American support it continues to receive. A week ago, we heard from Trump an ultimatum essentially saying, accept my 28 points or we'll cut you off from intelligence aid, we'll stop selling weapons even potentially to Ukraine. Now Ukraine seems to have managed to soften that, and now Trump is talking much less confrontationally, and when there's no longer any major deadline. So Ukrainians will consider that a success. But will there be any progress toward peace? Frankly, I'm very sceptical. I don't see the grounds for that negotiated settlement at this point. I think the war will continue, and the realities on the ground will continue to dictate into 2026, unfortunately.
That's very well put. Mrs. Zakharov, would you like to say a few words?
Unfortunately, I agree. I don't see many prerequisites for the peace agreements in the near term. I think that the important factor that we didn't mention is that Russia remains very dismissive of the European position and European demands. And I think that if we look at the negotiations process, we would see that there is a track of talks between US and Russia, which has progressed relatively well, of course, with some disruptions. There have been even direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, even though these were mainly focused on humanitarian issues, on the exchange of prisoners of war, etc. But what we haven't seen is any kind of attempt to reach an understanding between Russia and Europe. I think except for probably a couple of phone calls, there have been no communication line, at least officially. And I think that the positions are starkly different between Russia and Europe. In this environment, and it's obvious that Europe should have a say because it's all about European security. Europe should be part of this resolution. But in the absence of any attempt to reach a consensus, it will be difficult to accommodate their visions of the end game.
That's very interesting. Dr. Sachdev, would you like to give us a...
I'm not that pessimistic in a sense that war will continue for ages now, because my feeling is that yes, that's also true that communications between Russia and Europe has almost broken. And one can argue that without having certain understanding reached by Europeans, it'll be difficult for any kind of peace agreement to, because ultimately it's Europe. It's something we're talking about here. But I think the way things have folded, and they are continue to unfold. My feeling is that Americans are still pushing for seriously. Of course, it may not be exactly the way we have seen. It may continue. It may not be exactly the the timelines which have been set. But I'm quite hopeful that in the next couple of weeks or 2, 3 months, somewhere we'll be in a position where some kind of a possible, I would say, agreement is likely. It may not happen because many things, these things, things can be derailed just with one event. Something things can go wrong. But now I can see many signs, even within Europe, to see that realities are different. Ground realities are different. Americans are pushing something very different, which they never expected. So I would think that in the next 2 or 3 months, we'll have some possibility of whether it's a permanent thing or it's going to be temporary, but we'll not be exactly in a situation where we are today.
That's very interesting. Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, I wanted to ask you the last question because, China's recent treatment of this young woman from Arunachal Pradesh was detained for 18 hours at Shanghai airport. I mean, wasn't Russia supposed to play the role of mediator between Beijing and Delhi?
I think Russia has been playing a very, you can say, constructive role in negotiating ties between India and China, for that matter. And they have, in many ways, tried to ensure that we don't fight or our differences are sorted out. But to be fair to the Chinese have been very consistent on Arunachal Pradesh. They always issue demarches, they issue memos, do whatever whenever
Yeah,
India or India violate that. So we may
yeah.
see it differently. We have a nationalistic press which starts talking about it, but they could also take it with a pinch of salt, whatever the Chinese do.
Yeah, but to get back to and conclude, in conclusion, to wrap up on the Ukraine-Russia impasse, I think after nearly 4 years of war, there is war weariness across Ukraine, across Europe. I mean, it could drive Ukraine and Europe into being arm twisted by the US and Russia into making these concessions. We don't know. We don't know where Russia will take this. But Ukraine soldiers are holding their own, even while Russia is advancing. This is going to be, as someone said, a very long, hard, and cold winter. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Dr. Sachdev. Thank you very much, Mr. Kapoor. Thank you, Mr. Dickinson, for those very interesting insights on where Ukraine stands. And a big thank you to you, Mr. Zakharov, for coming on the show and giving us a Russian perspective. Thank you for watching Global Express. Do click on the New Indian Express website and click and share.